Hello, I'm Peter Singer. It is a great pleasure and an honor to be able to join you to speak to this topic of artificial intelligence and the impact that it will have on the world, but also new tools of communication and explanation that we might use in exploring this story. Now, I know though at a certain point you're going to get tired of looking at my face on a screen, so hopefully if the technology allows us here, we're going to do a share screen. We'll be able to give you some visuals to keep you entertained a little bit along the way. Now, the starting point for this conversation, seemingly about the future, is actually to go back in time. Around 10 years back, I had a book come out called Wired for War that explored how the technology of robotics, seemingly from science fiction, was being used in our real world. For example, in Afghanistan in 2001, our forces go in, have 0 unmanned systems in them. Now, of course, they're widespread around the military. Nations in NATO, but also adversaries like Russia, China, are all wrestling with how do we utilize unmanned systems? How do we train for them? What's the proper doctrine? What's the right one to buy? To even larger questions of what do they mean for when and where we go to war? For example, the United States has carried out the so-called drone wars, air war campaigns into multiple nations where we don't have troops on the ground. Pakistan to ongoing right now in Somalia. Huge impact from that. But since there have been all sorts of changes, particularly in the technology itself, we've seen how this technology in many ways was defined by, and even how we talked about it, by what it is not, unmanned. The same way we talked about horseless carriages back in the past, as opposed to robots, as opposed to automobile. And once we've gotten out of that kind of thinking, we've seen a change, for example, in the designs, all sorts of different forms, where we're not designing it around a system where the human is packed in there, a plane with a cockpit painted over. As we get away from that kind of thinking, it's also allowed vastly different types of sizes, everything from teeny tiny systems to systems that are pretty massive in scale. This one is the size of around 3 houses put together. But there's a larger change going on, not in the hardware, in the form or size, but in the software, what operates it, what connects it, where we are measuring systems, technology, including weapons, not by how much faster they fly, how much further they fly, but rather how intelligent, how autonomous they are, what they can do on their own. At early stages was things like take off and land on their own. Then it's fly mission waypoints on its own. Then it's carry out certain parts of the mission on their own. We're not in the world of the Terminator, but we are definitely thinking about our technology in very different ways because of this intelligence. And that, of course, is changing all sorts of ways that we operate and think about warfare itself. But that is only part of the story. As fast as the change that's gone on in war, it's only gone faster in the civilian side. And that's why this story is a story not just of military technology, not just of technology, but maybe one of the most important stories in the history of humanity itself. The rise of artificial intelligence and increasingly autonomous and intelligent hardware when it comes to the robotics. Think about it this way. 2001, we had that story of what happened since then in war with unmanned systems from Afghanistan. On the civilian side, even faster, 300% growth rate when it came to industrial robotics. But it's also larger than that. 2001, it was an Arthur C. Clarke story about AI. Now AI is a real technology disrupting fields that range from finance to medicine to manufacturing. But we are only at the start of this. There is no other technology area that is moving as fast, is being funded as deeply, has as wide an array of participants as this space where the cutting edge of hardware and software come crashing together. For example, there is an estimated 153 billion US dollars worth of spending in this space with an annual creative disruption impact of $33 trillion. The participants range from all the leading governments of the world. For example, it's at the center of the US National Defense Strategy to at China's government plan to be the world leader in AI by the year 2030. It involves all the leading research universities, from the Oxfords to the MITs, to it involves all the leading companies of the world, from the expected tech companies like the Microsofts, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Baidus, but it also involves companies that you might not expect but are major players in this. For example, both John Deere and McDonald's in the last year respectively bought up a leading AI startup company because they believe the future of fast food, the future of farming is AI and robotics. It's also what's playing out in that next generation, the companies that want to be the next John Deere, the next Google. The founder of Wired magazine described it this way, quote, "I think the formula for the next 10,000 startups is to take something that already exists and add AI to it." Now, if this was already in motion before the pandemic, it's only accelerated. In some areas, it's jumped the timeline forward. For example, the field of telemedicine. In internal corporate discussions, they thought they would be 10 years from now where they jumped ahead in a matter of months this spring. In other areas, it's taken us well beyond any corporate projections. For example, distance work, like a lot of us are doing right now, distance learning, what our kids are doing right now, well past what industry thought. In the hardware side, we've seen the rollout and deployment and then scaling of robotics in all sorts of different ways. Take, for example, delivery. We have seen drones deployed to do delivery of everything from grocery. One of them, I'm in Washington, D.C. One of them in Washington, D.C. is driving down the sidewalks right now doing grocery deliveries. To they've been doing deliveries of coronavirus test kits in the air. It's also hitting areas like surveillance. We have an AI-fueled tracking of society writ large, but also individuals on a scale that not just science fiction didn't anticipate, but even the Chinese government didn't plan for. And yet, if we are headed into what's been excitingly called everything from a new industrial revolution to a second machine age, my sense is that we have three big questions to figure out. The first one of these is, what will be the impact of all of this automation on jobs and everything that flows out from those jobs? Now, while many people feel that new technologies lead to new jobs, new opportunities, the data also shows that they lead to displacement and replacement on a massive scale. That is what happens when you rewire the economy, when you rewire the military, and of course, the society beyond it. Now, I put together a massive data set of every single report, every single projection that we could find on this. It's some 3,000 in total. So, for example, you have Oxford University researchers who looked at 702 different occupations, many of them, of course, that have military parallels to them. And they found that in the United States, for example, 47% of employment is at risk for replacement or reduction by robotics and AI within the next 2 decades. Now, others looked at the data and found something different. The consulting company McKinsey, for example, looked at these same trends and said, no, you pointy-headed academics at Oxford, you don't know what you're talking about. It's not 47%, it's 45%. PricewaterhouseCoopers, a corporate rival of McKinsey, said, no, we're looking at these things. We've got different methodology. You're wrong. It's not 45%, it's 38%. The low end in this data set is OECD at 9%. 9% of all jobs is still a pretty big deal. Now, each of these, of course, have, as I mentioned, parallels, and not just the trigger puller, role of the direct warfighter, but all the roles across the military, everything from medicine to logistics to I'm the son of a military lawyer, we're seeing its impact there. But there's something larger going on here. even if one takes the most optimistic view that everyone who's somehow displaced finds a new job, which might be a pretty rosy scenario because this is a technology that's different. This is not the last industrial revolutionary story of, someone putting down their shovel and then going to work at an assembly line with a hammer in their hand, or from, manufacturing hammer in hand to smartphone in their hand. This is the story of a technology, a tool that is increasingly intelligent, increasingly independent, taking on more and more of the role of the worker themselves. Now, even if you don't buy that, you still have the transition period of all of this displacement and replacement. So the result of this is a pretty huge impact, a historic level impact. As the director of MIT's Media Lab put it, quote, "Every area of life will be affected, every single one," end quote. Think about how the last industrial revolution was a story of economic and then as a result, political, military, winners and losers at the organizational level, but also the global level. Think about how it spawned, everything from mass production of consumer goods to weapons to climate change. Think about how it spawned mass population movements, but also new mass political movements. And here again, they might be positive ones. No industrial revolution, no children's rights, no workers' rights, no women's rights. Oh, by the way, the Industrial Revolution also spawned fascism, communism, ideologies we'd spend the next century working our way through. The second issue is every time you get a new technology, you get new questions about its use and the right and wrong of that. It happened with the flying machine. It happened with the submarine. It happened with the computer. No surprise, it would happen here again with AI and robotics. But go back to that technology, that tool, how it's different. It's not just about the human use. We have a new kind of use that opens up new kinds of legal and moral ethical questions we've never wrestled with before. And they really come into two categories. One is machine permissibility. What should our ever more intelligent, independent technologies be allowed to do without us? And the second is machine accountability. Who owns them? Who owns the fruits of what they do, the information that they gather when they're out there on their own? Who owns them when something goes wrong? Who is held accountable? And what's so fascinating and so important is that these questions cut across so many different areas. They're playing out on our highways. They'll play out in our wars. And that's because the technology itself is playing out in all of these different areas. Take something like face recognition. Face recognition is the technology that's being utilized and researched for the military. There's a US military program that is working on target identification, face recognition at 1,000-meter distance in the dark. It's also being deployed by police forces, both urban ones, London, New York City, rural ones, West Virginia. It's being deployed by companies, both expected tech companies, the social media companies, to ones that you might not expect. Kentucky Fried Chicken had a face recognition program. Now, the result of this is all sorts of potential gains and efficiencies in everything, from targeting and warfare to targeting of customers. Also, new questions that meld together everything from Big Brother to, when it's Kentucky Fried Chicken doing face recognition, Big Colonel. Now, there's a third question area, all sorts of new security issues. This new kind of technology is always, as I mentioned, gathering information. And that yields not just issues of privacy, but also new security questions. Because of AI, you have not just a gathering on scale. Every one of those technologies is observing, gathering, but you also therefore can bring it together and get a sheer mass of data that couldn't exist before, but also utilize that data in new ways. So think about face recognition technology. It matches the face to an identity, whether it's on a battlefield or you're walking into a train station. But then it can take that identity and link it back to every bit of data we have about that person. Everything that they posted online, everything that they bought, everywhere that they went, not just them, their friends, their family. You can then use that information not just to create a history, but also to create a forward-looking projection of them and people like them. Where will they go next? Where will they deploy military forces next? How will they vote next? You can also use that information not just to predict, but to influence, to shape them in ways that might be obvious and ways that are gentle pushes in the background. Here again, to buy something, to go a certain way, whether it's a route in their drive to a route in a military deployment. That's the world that we're entering into. That yields a massive rethink of not just marketing, but the battlefield itself. We are on the level of the kind of change that happened in, say, 1914, when the first flying machine crossed over to the other side and was able to send back reports of German movements in a way that wasn't possible. But also we began to see not just reports, but I can do targeting, I can do operations, I have to fight in this space. It's on the level of a 1940 and how wireless communications and flying machines now fuse with armored vehicles to create a new kind of doctrine, blitzkrieg. But here again, because it's not just human use of the technology, but a different kind of technology, different kind of tool, maybe it's something more than that. But it also opens up not just these new kind of operations and opportunities, it also leads to new vulnerabilities that might be exploited. Unfortunately, every one of these intelligent tools that we're baking into the old internet, we're also baking in security vulnerabilities. And the result is that cyber attacks will increasingly not just be about the theft of information, but about creating kinetic change in the world. We're already getting little tastes of this. For example, Israel's water system was attacked, and they were not trying to steal information from it, email, IP, how to build your own jet fighter, whatever. They were trying to change the information in it, and as a result, change the world beyond. In this case, to sabotage the water itself. The worry here is this kind of targeting can play out either on a city regional level, or you might do it at a tailored level. I don't want to plot spoil a book that I'm going to talk about soon, but you might do it against a single individual in their smart home, for example, killing someone without ever leaving your own home. Or that example of the going after water systems, if you believe that water systems in the UK or the United States have better cybersecurity than the Israeli government, having researched this, I can tell you that I have really, really bad news for you. But while we face these three big questions, these three big challenges, we also have three problems in how we reckon with them. Three problems in how we talk and think and react to the challenges of AI and automation. The first is the disconnect between the importance of the problem and our understanding and timeline for it. You can illustrate this in two ways. One is in a numeric. They did a survey of leaders. They found that 91% of them say AI is the most important technology out there, the biggest game change to come. And that makes sense. It's reflected, as I mentioned, in all of those documents, whether they're military strategic plans to corporate strategy, you name it. 91% say most important. 17% say, I understand it, I get it, let alone all the dilemmas, applications that I talked about before. Only 17% say they have just a base awareness of it. And as you well know, leaders, when they're evaluating themselves and how well they understand something, they're usually a little bit, over positive. So that 17% is probably not really as high as 17%. But the point is, that is a massive delta between 91% saying this is the most important technology out there and 17% saying, I get it. We also see this in anecdotal ways and also how it relates to the timeline. You see leaders saying, okay, it's an issue, but it's not an issue for the now. As the Secretary of the Treasury in the US said, quote, it's not even on our radar, end quote, because it's not going to present any problems for, quote, 50 to 100 more years away, end quote. That is verifiably wrong. Not just because of how we see these technologies being applied today in war, in medicine, but it's already been shaping our world. For example, manufacturing. Over 80% of jobs lost in manufacturing over the last 20 years was due to automation. So this is already shaping our world. Why should we think it's going to be off in this sci-fi distance? There's a second problem, and it's illustrated by this. This is a robot that is designed to examine stovepipes. Now, that's a kind of bad joke of going after the problem, in that when we do talk about these issues, we are locked within field or organizational stovepipes. So the people that are interested in the future of work are very different than the people who are interested in the future of war, and are very different from the people interested in, say, Internet of Things cybersecurity, or legal and moral ethics of technologies like AI and face recognition. And so the result is that for a space that's all about networking, we're actually going after these stovepipes and missing a lot that's happening out there. And the third is illustrated by this. Just as the technologies of science fiction are becoming real, unfortunately, the fictional way that we frame their effect on our world is not all that helpful. We are on the 100-year anniversary of the creation of the word robot. And it was created in this play that you see here from 1920 called R.U.R. The playwright took the Czech word for servitude and turned it into a descriptor for this new idea that he had of mechanical servants who wised up, they grew intelligent, and then they rised up against their human masters. And ever since, that story of a robot revolt has played out through our pop culture and science fiction, from 2001 to the Terminator to the Matrix, you name it. Now, that would be fine if it stayed in science fiction, but it's also colored the way we think about it in the real world. The narrative of killer robots is played out everywhere from military, there's Pentagon policy on it, to it was literally debated on the floor of the UN, to by my tracking, over $6 billion US has been spent by foundations, philanthropists, universities to study the existential threat of robots. Now, maybe one day we're going to have to figure out whether to salute or fight our metal masters. But in your and my lifetime, the issue is not a robot's revolt. It is going back to this notion of a robotics revolution, what it means to live, work, fight as an industrial revolution goes on all around us. So how do we deal with this? Well, how I've tried to deal with this is by going after another kind of new tool, which is a new tool of research and communication. We built a book called Burn It that is a combination of a novel and nonfiction. So it is a story of the hunt for a terrorist in a future Washington, D.C. But baked into the story are over 300 explanations and predictions of everything from how does AI actually work to what are the planned applications by everyone from the police to Amazon, to what are some of the technologies that are going to come, everything from delivery drones to what's the next special operations sniper rifle going to be like, to maybe most importantly, what will be the effect of it on our politics, to what will be the military, legal, moral dilemmas that we'll have to face. For example, what is algorithmic bias? These are all baked into the story. And even more, they come with 27 pages of research endnotes to document how this is not drawn from imagination. Each one of those, here's the real world research that it's pulled from, just like you would have in a nonfiction book, because in part it is a nonfiction book. Basically, the way to think about it is that it is the equivalent of what I do to my kids in the morning, which is we sneak veggies into their smoothie. This is the same thing, except for policymakers and the public, where you're sneaking in real world important research and information, but packaged in a manner that they're more likely to read and remember than a boring memo or white paper or a PowerPoint. The concept of what we call useful fiction is basically it comes from three different attributes of narrative. The first is research shows that narrative is a more effective means of conveying new ideas and complex ideas. There's a lot of different data behind it of the value of what they call synthetic environments. Basically, it comes down to the fact of how our brains are wired. Narrative is the oldest communication technology of all. We were using it back when we were gathered around fires. PowerPoint, by comparison, it's 30 years old. So it's not all that surprising that our brains are literally wired to take in narrative in a more effective manner. Actually, when you look at the parts of the brain that fire, when they receive a conventional briefing, for example, read a memorandum, 2 parts of it light up. When you read a narrative, 4 parts of it light up. The second is narrative, at least when it's done well, provokes emotion. And as everyone from politicians to used car dealers know, emotion is what leads to action, not just understanding. And then the third attribute is distribution and connection. Basically, people are more likely to share a narrative with someone else. So in this case, you can have the target audience do the work for you. Here again, the way to think about it is no one ever came back from vacation and told someone, man, I was on vacation and I read the best PowerPoint. You would really enjoy it. No one ever was in a meeting and they yawned and someone said, yo, what's going on? I was cut up late at night reading this amazing white paper. I wanted to put it down, but it was such a cliffhanger. I had to get to the next segment of the white paper. No one's ever done that. They do that about useful fiction. And actually know they do that because that story of someone yawning in a meeting, that was actually a 4-star US Navy admiral in the tank in the Pentagon who shared our package of a prior book called Ghost Fleet in that way through that means of basically a yawn is what led him to share the book with someone else. It actually also led to a series of investigations to show up US military supply chain vulnerabilities, all from a novel, all from a yawn. And that has been part of the excitement of the Burn-In Book project, is that it had 2 parts to it. The one is to share this information that we talked about previously of thinking about AI and its impact on our world. But it was also a test of, can we use this tool of useful fiction on a different topic than, for example, what a war between the US and China might look like. And so far, it's been very exciting to see the result of it. Myself and my co-author on it, we have spoken to over 75 different organizations who work on real world important issues about it. Actually, I should add, I guess it's now 76. And they range from CIA to the European Parliament. What's also been exciting is groups have approached us and said, hey, can you do this on our important topics? So for example, in the United States, we have It's called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. It is an official commission led by 2 senators from each of our parties that is in charge of rethinking all of US cybersecurity strategy. Their team created a white paper on what US cyber strategy should be. It's going to guide us for the next decade. It worked 6 months on it, 40 plus people, 180-page paper. Their nightmare scenario, though, was what if we do all this work and not enough people read it, or it doesn't have impact? And so they approached us to do a package of useful fiction in lieu of a standard introduction or executive summary. We basically tailored a scenario designed to go after their target audience, explain the themes from the report, but also pull at their emotional threads to make them more likely to act on the recommendations. We've also had experiences where groups have approached us and asked us, don't do it for us, teach us how to do it. For example, parallel to your world, in the US Air Force, we have the Blue Horizons team. It's our future cell. And we took their team through a short course on how to do this kind of work of both how do you do forecasting, but also how do you do communication in a more effective, more impactful way. So in summary, we've covered a lot of ground in this talk, but I hope you take away from it 2 lessons. The first is we are in a time of enormous change. We are in a time of historic, human history level change when it comes to the technology that is emerging and its impact on our businesses, our families, our politics, our wars. So given this amount of change that's going on, individuals, organizations, nations that choose not to face this change, not to try and understand this change, not to try and change with it, are making a deliberate choice. They are choosing to lose the future through their inaction. And I hope none of us do that. And then the second takeaway lesson is, given all of this change that's out there, shouldn't we also potentially explore changing the way that we try to communicate what is important, what matters, what is new? So I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you about these topics, and I want to wish you the best in the rest of your session. And please do feel free to reach out to me in the future in any ways that I can aid. Take care.